I'm going to bring in MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin, who's at the Manhattan Criminal Court. So, Lisa, there is the federal court, there is the state court. How is it going to be carried out today?
Well, Jose, our understanding as of this morning was that Luigi Mangione, once extradited from Pennsylvania, would show up at the courthouse right behind us, 100 Center Street. That's the Manhattan Criminal Court, where he would face arraignment on the 11 charges brought by the Manhattan District Attorney. But as you were just discussing with Rahima, we now understand that it's possible that the federal government, acting through the Department of Justice and specifically the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, will bring charges first. The question is, how are those charges going to differ? In the ordinary course, murder charges or possession of weapons, those are state crimes, but there can be certain aggravating factors that allow the federal government to bring those charges instead. One of the things that might differentiate a federal charge, for example, from a state charge is the interstate movement of Luigi Mangione to target Brian Thompson, the United Health CEO, who he allegedly murdered. So if you are, for example, not only carrying out a murder in a premeditated way, but you are purposefully trying to track somebody's movements from state to state and following them, essentially, in order to commit that crime, that's where you've got the possible involvement of the federal government. There are also certain federal charges having to do with guns that are different in nature and kind than the kinds of charges that can be brought in state court. Those are the two kinds of charges that I'm looking for to see if they manifest in any federal indictment, as we're expecting today, Jose.
Yeah, and Charles, I mean, this of all the different counts, 11 in the state court, in New York, in the state one, there is including a first-degree murder in furtherance of terrorism. What is that count, and what are the difficulties that prosecutors have in getting that count to stick?
Sure, Jose. One of the biggest things about this case that's interesting when you're watching is the notion of establishing intent. And when you're talking about this particular charge, the first-degree murder charge with respect to terrorism is a purely almost intent charge in terms of what it needs, what the government is going to need to establish and prove to solidify the idea that Mangione committed this murder for the purposes of essentially stoking a larger fear, not just with Brian Thompson. And in this case, the argument is going to be that he committed this crime for the purposes of essentially scaring the healthcare industry into doing what it was that they are not doing now. That is the motive that prosecutors are going to have to make out if they want to establish this first-degree murder with the terrorism piece to it. That is going to be helped by the manifesto that they found in his bag, but it is still going to be a very high burden that the prosecution is going to have at trial, because you're not just talking about one individual, you're talking about the effect that it's going to have, or that they are going to imply that he wanted to have on an entire industry. And that's very, very difficult to prove.
And we are now getting word that indeed the Justice Department, through the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, is expected to file federal charges this afternoon against Mangione. And there, Misty, there is the issue of death penalty.
Correct. So this is likely to manifest as a stalking murder. We know that Luigi Mangione, according to what's reported, traveled to New York specifically to target Brian Thompson. And so because he crossed state lines, because we have the manifesto, there was also another notebook, which was a planning document that investigators are looking at. All of that is going to be pieced together to establish that he traveled to New York interstate for the purposes of killing Brian Thompson. And that's what makes it federal.
I was just thinking, that is what makes it federal. And then what is it that makes it death penalty versus in contrast to the state charge?
So if the state charge in New York, the death penalty hasn't been a part of New York law for many, many years. But under federal law, the death penalty is applicable. Like any other death penalty statute, there have to be aggravating factors with respect to the case in order for the death penalty to be on the table. The feds are going to have to make that determination whether they'll seek the death penalty. In a case like this, it's certainly something that could be applicable. And keep in mind, Jose, you know, you have a case here now, these really high-level charges, now the death penalty potentially on the table. Is this something to possibly leverage a plea deal?
Right.
Take the death penalty off the table, plead guilty, life without parole. In New York, plead guilty, maybe 25 years to life, have the opportunity to parole a 26-year-old guy.
It's very important to understand that even without the death penalty, what we're looking at here, more likely than not, especially with respect to the federal charges, is life in prison if Mr. Mangione is convicted of first-degree murder. It doesn't necessarily have to rise to the point of capital punishment, but even without that, it's very, very probable that prosecutors will seek to have him get life. And if they do invoke the idea of a plea deal, it's going to likely be life in prison.
And so, Lisa, there is communication and agreement between state and federal in a case like this?
Not necessarily, Jose, and oftentimes there's a lot of jockeying behind the scenes as to which office will bring charges first or which will bring charges at all. Oftentimes you see one office standing down in lieu of the other, and that's a particularly complicated history when you're talking about the two prosecutorial offices at issue here, one being the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, the other being the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. As you were discussing with Misty and Charles, federal charges often carry greater severity of punishment due to those aggravating factors. The interstate travel, sometimes the federal law punishes the possession of gun paraphernalia used to accomplish crimes in different ways than states do. Here, I'm not sure that we see an agreement yet. In fact, we're getting conflicting information this morning about which office is prepared to go first in charging Luigi Mangione. It's not clear to us where Luigi Mangione will be arraigned first, whether he'll be arraigned here in the court behind me at 100 Center Street in Manhattan or just around the corner at 500 Pearl Street. We, NBC News, continue to work on getting reportable and reliable information. And as soon as we have that, Jose, we'll come to you with where that lands.
Misty, this guy seems, in many ways privileged. I mean, he's got a team of lawyers in Pennsylvania. He's got this high-powered attorney team in New York City. What do you see as the possible defense for the New York team with this specific amount of information and, video cross-referencing?
Right. What the defense team is going to try and do is get some of that evidence precluded. Yes. They're going to look at how that evidence was actually collected. So, he's apprehended at a McDonald's, right? And so he's asked to take his mask down. That's where a lot of the literal smoking gun, right? He has the ghost gun in his possession. He has the manifesto. He has the false ID, which he had used in New York. If you can get some of that precluded because there was no warrant to search the backpack wasn't searched according to in violation of his constitutional rights, the case changes dramatically. And there can be what's called fruits of the poisonous tree, meaning any other evidence that was collected and as a result of what was found could also be precluded. The defense team is going to make that argument. Whether it's successful, we can't tell as of now because we don't have that information.
Jose, one of the things to consider with a case like this is that you're talking about multiple jurisdictions and multiple agencies from law enforcement that have had their hands in this case. Every time someone else touches this investigation creates the potential for, as Misty was talking about, something to go awry with respect to the chain of custody, with respect to how he was apprehended, with respect to anything that was recovered as part of the investigation. And so you're going to, as a defense attorney, be looking at every I and every T to make sure they were dotted and crossed. And if anything's amiss, you're trying to get it thrown out.